Hello, shameless writers. I'm Kristen McTiernan, the nonsense-free editor, here for your weekly dose of writing wisdom. I get the majority of my content ideas through my editing clients and the frequent issues that come up, and one of the biggest ones is dialogue. Of course, there are several authors who just don't know how to use dialogue or sometimes choose not to use it at all for baffling reasons. But the worst thing I get is when clients have followed certain rules regarding their dialogue. You've probably heard about some of these on YouTube already, such as never use said because said is dead, or said is invisible. You should only use said, except very rarely. You have all of these rules that you're supposed to be following in dialogue, apparently. The only problem with that comes when you stick over much to rules. You're not really allowing your story to flow, and instead you're focusing on a sort of literary legalism. And so in an effort to kind of dispel that, if you are one of these hyper-legalistic authors that you feel you have to stick to certain rules about dialogue, or you just don't know what to do about dialogue in the first place, I'm creating this video of 10 ways to write strong dialogue. You'll notice that the word rules is nowhere in the title and nowhere in the description. These are not rules. It's important for you to listen to all 10 of them, and then as you go through your scene, pick and choose which one of these you want to apply to your dialogue for this specific scene with these specific characters. Reason number one to have dialogue is that it is essential to the story. Not important, not helpful, essential. This dialogue is communicating an important plot point. This dialogue is communicating something important about the character, something perhaps they would not think about themselves, but because we are hearing what they are saying, even if they are an unreliable narrator, we can see who they really are. Their words have revealed them to us. There's many ways that dialogue can be used to communicate essential aspects of the story as opposed to having large blocks of narration. Depending on the type of book you're writing, you may wish to use dialogue to communicate this essential fact instead of using exposition. Number two goes along with this. It imparts information that the characters already know. There's nothing worse than having a piece of dialogue such as this. Well, Tom, as you know, we're twins and we were born 2 minutes apart. No one talks like that, and it is preposterous. So of course, we don't want to use that type of dialogue. This is especially common because, one, as writers, we don't want to have those big blocks of exposition, and we instinctively know that we should insert some dialogue in here so that we can make it a little bit more interesting. The problem is the execution. I'll give you a wonderful example that when I heard it, it made me laugh out loud. Now, this is not from a book. This is from a TV show, specifically Murder, She Wrote. And as we know, episodic television has its own constraints. And so I feel a little more forgiving to these writers than I do for a novel writer. But let me read you this little bit of dialogue that came from one of the episodes of Murder, She Wrote called The Great Twain Robbery. You're not here for some kind of a shakedown, are you? I mean, that was never your style. The other responds to him. These are both really smarmy men, by the way, like porn stashes and everything. The other responds, well, what could I tell anyone? That you were absolutely the best forger I'd ever met, and second only to me as a con man. Really? Is this how con men talk to each other? I'm pretty sure they don't. Ever. Even if they were in private, which these characters were not. They're in the middle of a crowded club car. It was preposterous and clunky and a ridiculous way to explain to the audience that these two people are scumbags. We could have deduced that from the mustaches. Now, like I said earlier, TV shows are sometimes confined to their finite space. They have to run in, I think it's like 24 minutes for a half-hour sitcom, and what is it like? It's like 47 minutes for an hour-long drama like Murder, She Wrote. And so sometimes the dialogue does get clunky. The problem is that we, as prolific television watchers, you're not fooling me, I know what you do with your off time. The problem is we ingest this craptastic dialogue, and in our little brains, we start to think that people talk this way. We know they don't, but we hear it so often. And so sometimes when we sit down to write, particularly when this is our first book, Murder, She Wrote crappy dialogue comes out onto our page. TV viewers will forgive bad writing, particularly if it's just one episode out of many. Book readers will not. If I had read a line like that in a book, particularly at my advanced age, and I'm such an impatient reader now, I would have tossed it aside. Option number 3, it adds conflict or tension. Of course, you don't want to add an argument simply for the case of having an argument, but there is nothing better than adding in a snide comment from one of the characters that will provoke your main character to say something that perhaps they normally wouldn't. Tension and conflict have many different uses, whether it's revealing something about our unreliable narrator, or maybe it's making us, the reader, understand that the main character is in danger when perhaps we didn't originally. Having conflict in your dialogue is a great way to reveal hidden things in a realistic fashion, because as we all know, when people are agitated or angry, they say things that maybe otherwise they wouldn't. Most importantly, when you're having a conflict, even if someone isn't terribly invested in the scene, it's not dull. I mean, it's almost impossible to make a fight dull. If you've written a dull fight, my good heavens, you're doing it wrong. So if you have a bit of backstory that you would like to communicate but are afraid of having too much exposition or having an info dump, God forbid, having a tension-filled conversation between 2 or more of the characters is a good way to circumvent that boredom possibility. Number 4, make sure your dialogue is compressed. This is not a rule because obviously different characters will speak in different ways. I'm reading right now The Art of Theft, which is a part of the Lady Sherlock series, and of course it's set in Victorian times. And so the dialogue is not compact by our standards, most certainly not. It's very languid and beautiful and British. It's wonderful. However, I strongly suspect it is different from the way people spoke back then because there are no ums, there's no rambling. In other words, it's not realistic, and that's a good thing. Dialogue, whether in a book or in a screenplay, is not the same as speech. And you know that if you've ever sat through a rambling graduation speech. I've sat through a couple of them. They're awful. So while we do want it to sound like something a human being would say, most specifically our character, we don't want it to be too realistic in the fact that it just drones on and on and on. Keep it compact. Get to the point. Number 5, speaking of realistic, the dialogue should be realistic to the setting and to the character. Each setting is different, and I recently had a client who made the mistake, and it's a very common mistake, of writing something that's supposed to be taking place during Victorian times, but transplanting her very modern, fourth-wave feminist ideals into the character's dialogue, the things that she said, the way that she behaved. This absolutely not only wouldn't happen at this point in history, no one would think to behave this way because really these mannerisms didn't exist. Certainly the phraseology didn't exist. The dialogue in itself was not bad. It was compact. It did fulfill many of the rules we've already talked about. However, it wasn't appropriate to the setting, and it wasn't appropriate to the character as she should have existed within that setting. If you're writing about a place wherein they spoke a different language than you speak, for instance, in Thunder of Time, most of the characters are speaking West Saxon or Old English for most of the book. So how do you get around this? There are many ways to do it, but what most people do is tailor the speech based on the character's social class. So regardless of the fact that the characters aren't actually speaking English, the most important thing is to get the tone right and ensure that their dialogue communicates who they are as a person, as well as their station in society. Number 6, speaking of stations in society, dialogue often can and should reveal a person's relationship and power dynamics with their conversation partner. For instance, I had a client one time where, the exposition was a little bit shoddy. I was reading through the scene and the whole time I legit thought that this was a boyfriend and a girlfriend having a conversation. Obviously, the boyfriend was much older, but that's not terribly uncommon in any time period, so I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until the end of the scene that I realized this is not her older boyfriend. This is her father. Now, obviously, it's an easy fix to go back in the exposition and say something about where Mildred turned to face her father with a furious look on her face. But here's the thing. In reading just the dialogue, I should have been able to deduce that this man was her father, that this man had complete control over her monetary expenditures, that this man had control over who she would marry or if she would marry, that this man had formed her character and dictated the level of education she received. I should have been able to deduce that from the way that they spoke to one another, but I didn't. The way that she had constructed the dialogue, it seemed very much as if these two were on at least mostly equal footing. Obviously, the time period in which she was writing the story was very patriarchal. I think it was around the 1600s. But the way one speaks to one's husband should differ from the way one speaks to one's father. Take into account the history of these characters. Not just whether they get along or always did, but what are the power dynamics? Is one rich and one middle class? Or even more pronounced, is one very wealthy and one very poor? The words that they use, not just to each other, but in general, will be different. The amount of profanity they use, or not at all, will be different. And in some instances, for instance, if you're writing in the Middle English period, they might not be able to communicate at all because the lower classes spoke Middle English and the upper classes and nobility spoke French. Number 7, please include exposition. In our rapid-fire, get-to-the-point writing style of the modern era, which I am very fond of, let it be known, there is a tendency to have something called talking head syndromes in many early drafts, which basically means your scene has the dialogue, and that's it. We don't know where in the room they're standing. We don't know what kind of room they're standing in. We don't know what they're doing while they're talking. All we can imagine, really, is floating heads. It's like that's all we have. As you construct your dialogue, make sure that while you're doing it, you are also constructing the scene around them. Theater people call it blocking, and this is what people are doing with their bodies while they are reading their lines. This is just as important. Would you want to go see a play where the actors just stand on stage and just talk out to the audience, just endless soliloquies? No, no one would go. Well, I take that back. I don't know what's happening in modern art these days, but I've seen some YouTube videos of some pretty heinous theater productions. But don't do that to your reader. It's not cool, and only pretentious rich people go to see these things. Including exposition is very important, not only so we can construct a scene, but also so we understand what your POV character is thinking. How they react to what the other person says to them can be just as important to their character development or to the plot construction as what they actually say, or what they don't say. Number 8, speaking of what they don't say, having dialogue that is rich in subtext can be so valuable. Now, full disclosure, I am not good at subtext. Not only am I an American, I am the plain-spoken Midwestern type of American. So whenever I watch, particularly foreign films, Japan especially, when they have these layers of subtext and it's just this rich dynamic relationship and so much of what they don't say drives the action of the scene, I'll have to admit that a lot of it goes right over my head and probably would even if I wasn't reading subtitles, because that's not how I roll. I say what I mean and I mean what I say. But just because I'm like that doesn't mean your reader should be saddled with the burden of reading on the nose, completely on-topic dialogue for the entirety of the book. A lot of people use subtext, especially when they're speaking to someone that they know well. So particularly when writing scenes where dialogue between family members is a thing, family members with a strained relationship most especially, remember to add in that subtext. What isn't your character saying, even though they want to? Number 9, dialogue tells us who the character is. Having dialogue in there tells us exactly what kind of character this is. Especially if they're a point of view character. If they think more than they speak, that tells us who they are. If every little thing that goes on in their head comes flying out of their mouth, a la Bridget Jones, who is wonderful, then yes, that's cringy. But it's funny and it's endearing, and we know who Bridget is. It's not just a matter of giving your character specific traits like, oh, she's so clumsy, or oh, she tells it like it is. You need to have a character who tells us who she is, or he, specifically through their dialogue. This is especially important when we're dealing with non-POV characters. Maybe they're not a POV character for this scene, or maybe they're not a POV character at all. And just because they're not a POV character doesn't mean that we don't need to know who they are, especially in genres like mystery. If you find that the bad guy comes completely out of left field and you had no idea what was going on, chances are the dialogue didn't drop those necessary little tidbits that we needed to figure it out. A side character doesn't mean a minor character. Let their words speak for them. And finally, number 10, Often good dialogue will tell us who a character wants to be. More often than not, I have to ask my clients, what exactly does this character want? I mean, yeah, they're doing a lot of stuff and action is happening and sometimes misfortune is raining down and it's all very dramatic, but I don't have any idea what this character wants out of life. This is especially troublesome when it comes to supporting characters. All they're talking about is what the main character wants and what the main character is driving towards. Okay, but why is the supporting character supporting the main character? What do they want? Do they want the same thing that the main character wants? Maybe, but maybe not. Is the enemy of my enemy my friend? Who knows? The dialogue should not only tell you who this character is, but who they want to be. Do they aspire to become nobility? Do they aspire to have an outlet for their anger that is bubbling just under the surface? Try as we might, human beings are not as good at lying as we think we are. Even when we put a lot of practice into it, even when we rehearse ahead of time. 9 times out of 10, if you spend enough time with somebody, they will accidentally tell you who they are and what they want, simply by virtue of the words that they say. Sometimes you have to listen carefully, but it's usually there. The same should be true of your characters that you write. Tell us who they want to be, or what they want for themselves. It's all well and good for them to react to the plot, but dialogue should be much more than that. It should be our window into all of the characters and give us that little edge that we need for those of us who like to predict the ending of the book. So those are my 10 tips for making your dialogue impactful. Again, they are tips, they are not rules. Writing fiction is more art than science, and it's always good to have a little well of ideas where you don't necessarily need to pull out everything in the well to make your work good. But it's good to have an assortment of suggestions so you can make it work for your specific novel. If you want to hear an example of how I do dialogue, at least in a modern paranormal setting, one of my complete audiobooks is now available on my other channel, which, to be honest, I don't use very much, but I did post one of my audiobooks up on there. You are welcome to listen to it for free and let me know what you think about the way that I've created dialogue. So until next week, take care and write well.